Welcome to the tutorial. Here's how today's demo is gonna work. First off, we're gonna make an underpainting for these portraits using super duper cheap acrylic paints. I will point out a few do's and don'ts of mixing your skin tones. Next, we'll move on to an oil paint mixing demo, and I'll show you step by step how I created Mr. Morgan Freeman. Lastly, we will be making a lighter skin tone palette for our Bill Murray portrait. We're mixing primary colors to make skin tones. Yeah. I went ahead and used really cheap acrylic paints, so if you're doing the same at home, shout out to you. Did you guys know that you can mix just those 3 primary colors to make brown, and then to adjust it to create the hue that you want, you just put in varying amounts of those primary colors. For instance, here my brown is too green, so I would put in the complement of green, which if you look at the color wheel is red. After that, when I get a brown that I really like, I can just add in varying amounts of white, and that will tint it to be lighter colors. And the same is true of going darker. You just mix your primary colors with black instead of white. And again, depending on the hue you want, just add different amounts of the primaries, and you can see we have a range of brown hues here. Some mistakes to be aware of with light skin tones is making sure that you are not creating tones that are just too bright. If I have an orange kind of color, just by adding blue, I will mute that color much more and create a more realistic shade. Same if you're just adding red and white, you're gonna end up with a piggy bank pink face. So make sure you add in some yellow and blue to tone that down, and you're gonna have a much more realistic set of swatches. Something to be aware of when you are mixing darker browns and have added black to it, if you go ahead and add white after that, by having both black and white mixed into your brown, you're gonna get more gray colors. We're going ahead and making our actual underpaintings now. You can see I'm only using the 3 primaries with the white and the black. The purpose of me doing these underpaintings is because I did eventually want to work in oils, and the acrylic dries much quicker than oil, so that I can more quickly develop my layers of my painting, really increase my shading and contrast, and build up some visual history. Oil paints take a day or 2 days or 3 days depending on how thick you paint and if you use medium, so I wanted to use acrylics to speed up that process. A major difference you'll see with these 2 portraits is that I was able to use pure black to create the really deep areas of blocked in color on Morgan's face. If I tried doing that with Bill's face, it would just make it look very flat and unrealistic and probably end up making his skin look rather gray. When I have a stronger base layer, a better underdrawing, a better underpainting, it makes my finished product take way less time and come out with a better result. I think I did a better job developing the underpainting on Morgan's face, and it set me up for a much faster process painting with oils. I ended up spending about an hour and a half on Morgan versus 3.5 hours on Bill, and I think Morgan's came out better. For mixing our oils, I'm going to expand our palette choices. You can use a more limited palette than this. This is what I use at home though. The only difference from this palette picture is I did end up adding some cadmium red to my palette as well as ivory black later. As I went through and mixed up my colors, basically I wanted to create different brown tones, and as I mixed them I wanted to compare them with our picture to make sure that our colors were really going to serve us. Color accuracy makes such a huge difference in the lifelikeliness of your actual portraits, so take your time and make sure you mix your colors well. I tried to create different transitionary tones, so I have different dark browns leading into lighter browns, and then I went ahead and worked on more pink tones and red tones, which I used in both the mouth, and if you'll notice in his face, he has a lot of red tones around his nose, doing his eyebrows, on his forehead crease, so those were helpful. The other thing I wanted to be aware of is in all the shadows on his face, they're very cool tones, so I added blues and purples to those to give that effect of cool light. I did make very dark shadows for his face as well, because on the sides of his cheek it's almost black but not quite, and to show some of the reflective light I added white to that. Lastly, I just made a dark brown for the really deep parts of the shadow on his his cheeks. And here's our palette. I did tweak some of these colors along the way as needed and mix some of them together. I included our palette on the side so you can observe how I use the colors we mixed. The things I want you to be aware of when you are painting a face are how shading relates to the highest parts and the receding parts of the face. Highlights hit the middle of his face the most. Areas that protrude, like his forehead and brow bone, the bridge of his nose, the tops of his nostril skin, his top of his lip, that cupid bow. Any area that really stands out is what's going to get the highlight, and then areas that curve around the side of his face, it gets darker, and that creates a really three-dimensional aspect to it. Other areas you're going to find shading are underneath the bones that protrude under his eyebrow bone, under his nose, under his lip, under his cheekbones. All of those will have shading on them. For doing his facial hair, I used a very small pointed brush, and I made very quick, slightly curving, flicking motions with super light pressure to keep my marks relatively thin. The same goes for his eyebrow hairs. Lastly of all, I went in with my black to deepen a few areas. Most important are the eye pupils, the nose holes, and that lash line because they have really deep shading inside of them. And the pupils of eyes, I've tried it with Payne's Gray and Burnt Umber. It just does not work for me. It comes out with a much more flat black, and da! Moving into Bill, I was actually able to use pretty much the same colors that I used with Morgan with only slight tweaks. Mainly I was able to just add white to those colors to tint them to be lighter. So when you are making deeper skin tones, what you'll do is you'll add all of your different color hues together, but just add less white, and if you want to go lighter, you'll just tint it lighter by adding white to it. All the same principles apply here as with Morgan's portrait in terms of where I applied shadows and highlights, though he does have different bone structure and texture to his skin, so I tried to be aware of that when I was creating shapes with my highlights and shading. An example of this would be on his cheeks. Morgan has much more perky apple cheeks, whereas Bill's cheeks pull down more. For this effect, I made my cheek highlight go longer and run down closer to the corners of his mouth. The biggest thing I wanted to point out with Bill's that's different from Morgan's is a glazing technique that I did that you might want to try in your portraits at home. So after my portrait completely dried, which for me only took overnight because I use liquid as my medium and it speeds my drying time, and I also use extremely thin layers of paint so it dries quicker, I was able to create translucent layers of paint to tone the face and deepen shadows as I desired. Basically, to do this, you just mix a proportionally high amount of medium in with your paints, and it creates a translucent shade of color that you can just paint over your dried painting. What's great about this is if your glazing doesn't come out the way you want it to, because your underlayer is dry, you can wipe it out and just start over with it. And da! Here's our portraits. If you guys have any questions about anything you saw in this tutorial, please leave them in the comments below. I will get to as many as I can and would appreciate community support answering questions that I cannot get to myself. In the near future, I'd like to make a do's and don'ts of hair painting, so look forward to that. Have a fantastic week, and I will see you guys next Friday. Goodbye!